In the shadowed halls of Greystone Manor, a calculating blackmailer is poisoned, and everyone's a suspect. Enter Miss Jane Marple, whose sharp eyes unravel a web of secrets, debts, scandals, and a deadly tumbler of whiskey, with the killer's careful clues pointing everywhere but the truth. Can she untangle the lies before the guilty slip away? A classic Agatha Christie-style mystery that will keep you guessing until the final shocking reveal. Chapter 1. The Gathering at Greystone Manor in the waning days of October, when the leaves of Devonshire turned to hues of amber and crimson. Greystone Manor stood as a monument to quiet grandeur. The estate, nestled in the rolling hills near St. Mary Mead, was a vision of Georgian elegance, its ivy-clad walls and tall windows gleaming under a pale autumn sun. The air carried a chill, and the scent of damp earth mingled with wood smoke from the village beyond. It was here, in this tranquil setting, that a storm of human passions was about to break. Miss Jane Marple, that unassuming yet razor-sharp spinster of St. Mary Mead, had been invited to Greystone Manor by her old friend, Lady Eleanor Ashby. The occasion was a week-end gathering to celebrate the engagement of Lady Eleanor's nephew, Charles Ashby, to Miss Vivian Harcourt, a young heiress of considerable charm and fortune. The invitation had arrived in Miss Marple's neat, unpretentious cottage with a note in Lady Eleanor's elegant hand, expressing a hope that Jane's keen eye for human nature might enliven the gathering. Miss Marple, ever alert to the undercurrents beneath such polite phrases, sensed a deeper reason for the summons. The drawing-room of Greystone Manor was aglow with candlelight as the guests assembled before dinner on Friday evening. The room, with its high ceilings and polished mahogany, exuded an air of restrained opulence. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting shadows across the faces of the assembled company, each of whom seemed to carry a private thought beneath their polished exteriors. Lady Eleanor, a stately woman of 60, presided with a serene smile, though her eyes darted occasionally to the door, as if expecting an uninvited guest. Beside her stood Charles Ashby, a handsome man of 32, with a quick laugh and a restless energy that suggested a mind not entirely at ease. His fiancée, Vivian Harcourt, radiated a delicate beauty, her auburn hair catching the firelight as she spoke softly to Charles, yet her fingers twisted the edge of her shawl, a small gesture that did not escape Miss Marple's notice. Also present was Dr. Hugh Langley, a local physician with a reputation for discretion and a penchant for expensive cigars, which he smoked with an air of quiet defiance. His wife, Clara Langley, a pale woman with a nervous laugh, seemed perpetually on the verge of speaking, but rarely did. Then there was Mr. Reginald Thorne, a solicitor from London, whose sharp features and sharper tongue hinted at a man accustomed to wielding influence. His niece, Beatrice Thorne, a quiet young woman with a penchant for sketching, sat in a corner, her pencil moving swiftly over a notebook. The final guest was Captain Desmond Falk, a retired naval officer and old friend of the Ashby family. His weathered face and booming voice filled the room with tales of his seafaring days, though Miss Marple noted a certain guardedness in his eyes when the conversation turned to matters of family. As the clock struck 7, the butler, Mr. Grayson, announced dinner. The party moved to the dining room, where a long table gleamed with silver and crystal. The meal was exquisite roast pheasant, glazed vegetables, and a fine claret, but the conversation was strained. Charles spoke of his plans for a new venture in London, a risky investment in shipping, which drew a sharp glance from Mr. Thorne. Vivian, meanwhile, deflected questions about her family's wealth with a practiced smile, while Clara Langley spilled a glass of wine and apologized profusely. Miss Marple, seated near the foot of the table, observed it all with her usual air of benign detachment. Her knitting needles clicked softly, a rhythm that seemed to steady her thoughts. She noted the way Captain Falk avoided mentioning his recent travels, the way Beatrice's pencil paused when Charles spoke of money, and the way Lady Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she raised her glass to toast the engaged couple. It was during the dessert course, as a rich chocolate torte was served, that the first hint of discord surfaced. Mr. Thorne, his voice cutting through the polite murmur, remarked, "I trust, Charles, that your fiancée's fortune is as secure as you believe. Wealth, like happiness, can be fleeting as One must be cautious. The room fell silent. Charles's face reddened, and Vivian's eyes flashed with something akin to fear. "My affairs are my own, Reginald," Charles said sharply, but the solicitor merely smiled, a thin, knowing smile that seemed to chill the air. Miss Marple's needles paused for a moment. She said nothing, but her mind catalogued the exchange, the veiled threat in Thorne's words, the defensiveness in Charles's tone, the flicker of unease in Vivian's expression. It was a small thing, perhaps, but Miss Marple knew that small things often held great truths that as the evening drew to a close, the guests retired to their rooms. The manor settling into an uneasy quiet, Miss Marple sat by her window. Gazing out at the moonlit gardens, she thought of the tensions she had observed, the secrets that hung unspoken in the air. Human nature, she murmured to herself, is a puzzle with many pieces, and some of those pieces are sharper than others. She did not yet know that, by morning, one of those pieces would draw blood. Chapter 2. The shadow of death. Dawn broke over Greystone Manor with a deceptive calm, the mist curling gently around the estate's ancient oaks. The household stirred slowly, the maids bustling in the kitchens, and the scent of fresh coffee drifting through the halls. But by 8 o'clock, a scream shattered the morning's tranquility, echoing from the upper floors and sending a chill through the heart of the manor. Miss Jane Marple, already awake and dressed in her sensible tweed, was sipping tea in her room when the cry reached her. She set down her cup with a steady hand, her eyes narrowing as she listened to the hurried footsteps outside her door. Moments later, a sharp knock preceded the entrance of Lady Eleanor, her face pale and her hands trembling. "Jane, oh Jane," she gasped, clutching the doorframe. "It's dreadful, simply dreadful. Mr. Thorne, he's dead." Miss Marple rose, her expression calm but her mind already racing. "Dead, you say? How, Eleanor? And where?" "In his room," Lady Eleanor replied, her voice breaking. "Grayson found him just now. It's not natural, Jane. I fear the worst." Without another word, Miss Marple followed Lady Eleanor through the manor's labyrinthine corridors to the guest wing. The door to Mr. Reginald Thorne's room stood ajar, and inside, a small crowd had gathered. Charles, his face ashen, Vivian, clinging to his arm, and Dr. Langley, kneeling beside the body. Captain Fawkes stood by the window, his jaw tight, while Clara Langley hovered near the door, wringing her hands. Beatrice Thorne, the solicitor's niece, was nowhere to be seen. Thorne lay sprawled across the bed, his sharp features frozen in a grimace of pain. His nightshirt was disheveled, and a faint bluish tint marred his lips. A glass tumbler, empty but for a few drops of amber liquid, rested on the bedside table beside a small vial. The room smelled faintly of almonds, a detail Miss Marple noted. With a slight tilt of her head, Dr. Langley looked up as Miss Marple entered. "It's poison, I'm certain," he said grimly. "Cyanide, by the look of it. He must have taken it sometime in the night." "Must have," Miss Marple repeated softly, her tone gentle but probing. "You are not certain, Dr. Langley?" Hesitated, his eyes flickering to the others. "Well, the symptoms are clear convulsions, the bluish pallor, but I'm no expert in toxicology. We'll need a proper postmortem." Miss Marple stepped closer, her gaze sweeping the room. The curtains were drawn, the fire in the grate reduced to ashes. A leather-bound notebook lay open on the desk, its pages filled with Thorne's precise handwriting. A gold fountain pen rested beside it, its nib stained with ink. The bed was slightly askew, as if Thorne had thrashed in his final moments. "Who saw him last?" Miss Marple asked, her voice cutting through the murmurs. Charles cleared his throat. "I did, I think. After dinner, we spoke briefly in the library. He was agitated, something about business matters. I left him there around 10. Alone?" Miss Marple's eyes, sharp as needles, fixed on Charles. "Yes, alone," Charles replied, though his fingers tightened on Vivian's arm. "I went to bed shortly after." Vivian nodded, her voice barely audible. "I retired around the same time. I saw nothing unusual." Miss Marple turned to Captain Fawkes, who had remained silent. "And you, Captain, did you see Mr. Thorne after dinner?" Fawkes' weathered face betrayed a flicker of unease. "I passed him in the hall, perhaps 10:30. He was heading upstairs. seemed in a hurry. Lady Eleanor, regaining some composure, spoke up. "Jane, I've sent for the police. They'll be here soon. But I thought, perhaps you might look into things. You have such a knack for these matters." Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression unreadable. "I shall observe, Eleanor, as I always do. But first, we must preserve everything as it is. No one is to touch anything in this room." As the others murmured their assent, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the vial beside the bed. It was small, unremarkable, yet its presence was a silent accusation. She noted the position of the tumbler, the angle of the pen, the faint crease in the rug near the door. Each detail, however small, was a thread in the tapestry of the crime. The police arrived within the hour, led by Inspector Conway, a sturdy man with a no-nonsense demeanor. He listened to Dr. Langley's assessment, examined the body, and declared, "The room a crime scene. Poison's a nasty business," he said, scribbling in his notebook. "Could be suicide, but I'm not ruling out murder. We'll need statements from everyone." Miss Marple, standing quietly to one side, watched as the inspector questioned the household. Charles's alibi was corroborated by Vivian, who claimed they had retired together. Captain Falk admitted to a late walk in the gardens, alone. Clara Langley said she had gone to bed early with a headache, while Dr. Langley claimed to have stayed up reading until midnight. Lady Eleanor, shaken but composed, confirmed she had locked the Manor's doors at 11, as was her habit. Beatrice Thorne appeared at last, her eyes red from crying. "I didn't see Uncle Reginald after dinner," she said softly. "I was in my room, sketching. He often worked late." Miss Marple noted the girl's trembling hands, the way her eyes avoided the bed. "You were close to your uncle, Miss Thorne?" she asked gently. Beatrice nodded, her voice catching. "He raised me after my parents died. He was stern, but kind in his way." As the police cordoned off the room, Miss Marple slipped away to the library, where she had last seen Thorne alive. The room was as it had been the previous evening, save for one detail. A single sheet of paper, torn from a notebook, lay crumpled in the wastebasket. She retrieved it carefully, smoothing it out. It bore a single word, written in Thorne's hand, "Blackmail." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. A dangerous word, she murmured, folding the paper into her reticule. "And a dangerous game." The Manor buzzed with unease as the day wore on. The guests confined to the drawing room under Inspector Conway's orders. Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting resumed. But her mind was far from idle. A man like Reginald Thorne, she thought, did not die by chance. Someone in this house had a secret worth killing for, and she intended to find it. Chapter 3. The arrival of Inside. Morning sun struggled to pierce the heavy clouds that hung over Greystone Manor, casting the estate in a muted, somber light. By mid-morning, the police had sealed off Mr. Thorne's room and Inspector Conway's. Men were combing the grounds for any trace of external interference. The household, however, remained confined to the drawing room, where an air of restless suspicion simmered beneath forced civility. Miss Jane Marple sat near the window, her knitting needles moving with their usual rhythmic precision. To an outsider, she might have appeared a mere observer, an elderly spinster lost in her thoughts. But her eyes, bright and unyielding, missed nothing. The way Charles Ashby's fingers drummed on the arm of his chair, the way Vivian Harcourt's gaze darted toward the door, the way Captain Falk stood rigidly by the fireplace, as if bracing for a storm. Lady Eleanor, ever the gracious hostess despite her evident strain, had arranged for tea to be served, though few touched the delicate sandwiches or scones. The weight of Reginald Thorne's death pressed upon them all, and the word murder hung unspoken in the air. It was at this moment that Miss Marple, with a polite clearing of her throat, drew the room's attention. "Eleanor, my dear," she said, her voice soft but clear, "might I have a word with each of the guests? I find that conversation often clarifies the mind." Inspector Conway, who had just entered with a notebook in hand, raised an eyebrow. "Miss Marple, with respect, this is a police matter. We'll handle the interviews." "Of course, Inspector," Miss Marple replied, her smile disarming. "But I am merely an old friend of the family, offering a listening ear. People sometimes share things with a harmless old woman that they might not with an officer of the law. Conway hesitated, then gave a curt nod. Very well, but don't interfere with my investigation. Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression one of perfect deference. She began with Charles Ashby, inviting him to join her in the small anteroom off the drawing room. The young man followed reluctantly, his handsome features taut with unease. Mr. Ashby, Miss Marple began, settling into a chair with her knitting. You mentioned speaking with Mr. Thorne in the library last night. Might you share what passed between you? Charles ran a hand through his hair, his eyes flickering to the window. It was nothing, really. Business matters. Reginald was, well, he was always poking into my affairs. Said he was concerned about the shipping venture I'm planning. Thought it was too risky. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. And, was it risky? I mean, Charles flushed. It's a sound investment. I've done my research. But Reginald had a way of making everything seem precarious. He was like that. Always looking for leverage. Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her eyes sharpened. Charles hesitated, then shrugged. He was a solicitor. It's in their nature, isn't it? Always looking for an angle, a way to control things. Miss Marple nodded, as if satisfied, and dismissed him with a gentle smile. Next, she spoke with Vivian Harcourt, who entered the anteroom with a nervous grace. Her auburn hair was neatly pinned, but her hands betrayed her anxiety. Twisting the hem of her sleeve, Miss Harcourt, Miss Marple said, You seemed distressed at dinner last night when Mr. Thorne spoke of wealth being fleeting. Did his words trouble you? Vivian's eyes widened briefly, then she composed herself. Not particularly. Mr. Thorne was always rather blunt. I suppose he meant to caution Charles. But it felt like a jab at me. My family's money, you see, it's a sensitive topic. Miss Marple tilted her head. Sensitive in what way, my dear? Vivian hesitated, her voice dropping. My father made his fortune in trade, not inheritance. Some people, Mr. Thorne included, think that makes it less respectable. But I assure you, it's all perfectly secure. Miss Marple murmured sympathetically, noting the slight tremor in Vivian's voice. She moved on to Dr. Langley, who entered with a weary sigh, his cigar case clutched tightly in one hand. Dr. Langley, she began, you were quick to identify cyanide as the cause of death. Have you encountered such cases before? Langley nodded, his eyes distant. Once or twice, in my early years. It's unmistakable, the smell. The symptoms. Poor Thorne must have suffered horribly. And the vial by the bed. Miss Marple said softly, Do you think he took it himself? Langley's brow furrowed. Suicide. Possible, I suppose. But Thorne didn't strike me as the type. He was too calculating. Miss Marple's needles paused. Calculating. An interesting choice of word. Doctor, did you know him well? Not really. Langley admitted, but he handled some legal matters for me years ago. He had a knack for finding weaknesses, yours or anyone else's. The interviews continued. Clara Langley, nervous and stammering, claimed to have slept through the night, hearing nothing. Captain Falk admitted to a brief argument with Thorne about a past naval contract, but insisted it was ancient history. Beatrice Thorne, still shaken, spoke of her uncle's protective nature, though her eyes grew distant when pressed about his recent activities. As the day wore on, Miss Marple retired to the library, where she examined the crumpled paper she had found the previous day. The word blackmail stared back at her, stark and accusing. She considered the alibis, Charles and Vivian at 10, Falk at 10:30, Lady Eleanor locking the doors at 11. The manor's isolation made an outside intruder unlikely, and the locked windows in Thorne's room supported that theory. Yet something troubled her, a detail so small it might have been overlooked. The tumbler on Thorne's bedside table had been nearly empty, but the drops of amber liquid inside suggested whiskey. Thorne, however, had drunk only claret at dinner, and no decanter was found in his room. Where had the whiskey come from? Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. A man does not drink alone unless he is troubled, she murmured, and a man like Reginald Thorne does not die without a reason. She tucked the paper back into her reticule and returned to the drawing room, where Inspector Conway was questioning the butler, Mr. Grayson. The inspector's notebook was filled with times and movements, But Miss Marple knew that times could be manipulated and alibis could lie. The truth, she suspected, lay not in what was said, but in what was left unsaid. As the clock struck noon, a maid entered with a tray of letters, one of which was addressed to Miss Marple. It was from her nephew, Raymond West, inquiring about her visit. She set it aside, her mind elsewhere. The puzzle was taking shape, and she sensed that the next piece would soon fall into place. Chapter 4. The questions deepened. Afternoon at Greystone Manor settled into a heavy stillness, broken only by the distant clatter of police activity and the occasional murmur of the gathered guests. The drawing room, once a place of polite conversation, now felt like a stage where each player guarded their secrets with care. Miss Jane Marple, seated by the fire with her knitting, observed the room with the quiet intensity of a hawk watching a field. Her needles clicked in a steady rhythm, but her mind was weaving a far more intricate pattern. Inspector Conway, his notebook now a thicket of scribbled details, had concluded his initial round of questions and was conferring with a constable. Near the door, his focus was on the vial of cyanide found beside Mr. Thorne's bed, which he believed to be the key to the case. Suicide or murder, he muttered to his subordinate. It's in that bottle. We'll have the lab confirm it soon. Miss Marple, overhearing, allowed herself a private thought. The inspector was a diligent man, but diligence alone would not unravel this knot. She rose, smoothing her skirt, and approached Lady Eleanor, who was attempting to maintain an air of composure despite the strain etched into her features. "Eleanor, my dear," Miss Marple said softly, "might I have a look at the household's daily routine? It would help me understand the rhythm of things here." Lady Eleanor blinked, then nodded. "Of course, Jane, Grayson can provide you with the staff's schedule, and I'll show you the guest arrangements myself." Together, they moved to the study, a cozy room lined with books and dominated by a large oak desk. Lady Eleanor produced a neatly typed schedule detailing the maid's duties, the butler's rounds, and the times of meals. Miss Marple studied it carefully, noting that the manor's doors were locked at 11 each night, as Eleanor had confirmed, and that the guest rooms were all on the same corridor. With Thorne's at the far end, was Mr. Thorne's room locked? When Grayson found him, Miss Marple asked, her tone casual. Lady Eleanor hesitated. "Yes, I believe so. Grayson had to use the master key to enter." "Why do you ask, Poe?" "Just a thought," Miss Marple replied, her eyes bright with interest. "And the windows, were they secure?" "Locked, as always," Lady Eleanor said. "The police checked them this morning." Miss Marple nodded, filing the information away. A locked room, a vial of poison, a tumbler of whiskey each piece, was a clue, but none told the full story. She thanked Lady Eleanor and returned to the drawing room, where she found Charles Ashby pacing near the window. "Mr. Ashby," she said, approaching him, "might we continue our little chat? I am curious about your conversation with Mr. Thorne in the library. You said he was agitated. Did he mention anything specific, any names, perhaps?" Charles stopped pacing, his expression wary. "Names? No, nothing like that. He was going on about my shipping venture, as I said. Kept saying I was in over my head, that I'd lose everything. It was personal, almost personal." Miss Marple repeated, her voice gentle but probing. "In what way?" Charles shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "He implied I was reckless, that I didn't deserve Vivian's trust. It stung, I'll admit, but I didn't think much of it at the time." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm. "And after you left him, did you see anyone else in the library or the hall?" "No," Charles said quickly, then paused. "Well, I thought I heard footsteps as I went upstairs, but I didn't see anyone. Probably just Grayson or one of the maids." Miss Marple thanked him and turned her attention to Vivian Harcourt, who was seated nearby, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Miss Harcourt," she began, "you mentioned your family's wealth being a sensitive topic. Did Mr. Thorne ever speak to you directly about it?" Vivian's eyes flickered with unease. "Once or twice," she admitted. "He asked about my father's business, the investments, that sort of thing. I thought he was just being thorough, as solicitors are, but it felt intrusive." "Did he ever suggest he knew something about your family?" Miss Marple pressed, her tone as soft as a whisper. Vivian's lips parted, then closed. "No," she said at last, but the hesitation was telling. Miss Marple made a mental note, her thoughts turning to the crumpled paper with the word blackmail. Had Thorne been probing into Vivian's fortune or someone else's? The afternoon wore on, and Miss Marple continued her quiet inquiries. She spoke with Captain Falk, who admitted to a lingering resentment toward Thorne over a disputed contract from their naval days. "He cheated me out of a fair share," Falk said gruffly. "But that was years ago, water under the bridge." Dr. Langley, when questioned further, revealed that he had prescribed sleeping draughts for Clara, who often struggled with insomnia. "She was fast asleep by 10, he said, "though I stayed up reading in the study until midnight." Clara, herself, when pressed, seemed flustered. "I heard nothing," she insisted, her voice trembling. "I took my draught and went straight to bed." Beatrice Thorne, still pale and withdrawn, offered little beyond her earlier statements. "Uncle Reginald was always working," she said. "He had enemies, I suppose, but he never spoke of them to me." As the day drew to a close, Miss Marple slipped back to the library where she examined the wastebasket once more. It was empty. Now, the crumpled paper she had found safely tucked in her reticule. But another detail caught her eye, a faint smudge of ink on the edge of the desk, as if someone had brushed against it while writing. She bent closer, noting the color black. Like the ink in Thorne's fountain pen, her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Conway, who carried a small evidence bag. "Miss Marple," he said, "we found something in the garden, a cigarette stub, half buried near the terrace. Odd thing is, it's not a common brand matches the kind." "Dr. Langley smokes." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "Indeed? And where was Dr. Langley at 10:30 when Captain Falk saw Mr. Thorne heading upstairs?" "Conway consulted his notebook. Says he was in the study, reading. No one to confirm it, though." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over the new piece of the puzzle. A cigarette stub, a locked room, a word scrawled in haste. The threads were beginning to connect, but the pattern remained elusive. She returned to her room, her knitting in hand, and sat by the window, gazing out at the darkening gardens. "Someone," she murmured, "is not what they seem, and someone has been very careless indeed." Chapter 5. The red herrings. The atmosphere at Greystone Manor grew thicker with suspicion. As the day waned, the low sun casting long shadows across the polished floors, the guests, confined to the drawing room under Inspector Conway's watchful eye, exchanged guarded glances, their polite facades fraying under the strain of Reginald Thorne's death. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual corner with her knitting, seemed almost invisible to the others, yet her presence was a quiet force, her mind sifting through the tangle of motives and half-dashed truths. Inspector Conway, emboldened by the discovery of the cigarette stub, had taken Dr. Hugh Langley aside for a more pointed interrogation. The physician's face was a mask of indignation as he protested. "I told you, Inspector. I was in the study until midnight. I don't smoke in the gardens too chilly at night, and besides, Clara dislikes the smell on my clothes." "Then, how do you explain this?" Conway held up the evidence bag, the cigarette stub clearly visible. "It's your brand, Doctor, and fresh enough to have been dropped last night." Langley's jaw tightened, but he offered no immediate reply. Miss Marple, overhearing, noted the flicker of unease in his eyes. It was a small thing, but she had learned long ago that small things often betrayed the guilty. Yet she also knew the danger of a too obvious clue. A cigarette stub in the garden was convenient, perhaps too convenient. She turned her attention to the others, her needles clicking softly as she considered the web of alibis. Charles Ashby's defensive tone when questioned about his library conversation with Thorne suggested a deeper grievance. Vivian Harcourt's hesitation when speaking of her family's wealth hinted at a secret she feared exposed. Captain Falk's old grudge against Thorne, though dismissed as ancient history, carried the weight of unresolved anger, and Beatrice Thorne, quiet and withdrawn, seemed to know more about her uncle's affairs than she let on. Miss Marple decided to probe further, beginning with Clara Langley, who sat twisting a handkerchief in her lap. "Mrs. Langley," Miss Marple said gently, joining her on the sofa, "you mentioned taking a sleeping draught last night. Do you often find sleep elusive? Clara's pale face flushed slightly. Oh, yes, quite often. The country air helps. But I've always been a light sleeper. Dr. Langley prescribed something to help me rest. And last night, Miss Marple pressed, her tone kind but insistent. You heard nothing unusual, even before you took your draft. Clara's eyes darted toward her husband, who was still speaking with Conway. Nothing. She said quickly, I retired early, as I said. I was asleep by 10. Miss Marple nodded. Her expression benign, but her mind noted the contradiction. Dr. Langley had claimed Clara was asleep by 10, yet she had earlier said she took her draft after dinner, around 9. A small discrepancy, perhaps, but Miss Marple knew that small discrepancies could unravel great lies. Her next conversation was with Beatrice Thorne, who sat alone by the window. Her sketchbook closed in her lap. Miss Thorne, Miss Marple began, settling beside her. Your uncle was a man of many responsibilities, I gather. Did he ever confide in you about his work or his worries? Beatrice's fingers tightened on the sketchbook. Not really, she said softly. Uncle Reginald was private about his business. He said it was for my own good, to keep me out of it. But you were close, Miss Marple said, her voice warm with sympathy. A niece often knows more than she realizes. Did he seem troubled in the days before we arrived? Beatrice hesitated, her eyes flickering with something like fear. He was distracted, she admitted. He received a letter a few days ago that upset him. He burned it in the fireplace, but I saw him reading it late at night. He looked angry. Miss Marple's needles paused for a moment. A letter, you say? Did you see any part of it? Beatrice shook her head. No, but it was on thin paper, with a red wax seal. He tore it up before burning it. Miss Marple filed this away, her thoughts returning to the crumpled paper in her reticule with the word blackmail. A letter with a red wax seal suggested something formal, perhaps threatening. Had Thorne been the blackmailer or the victim? As the afternoon progressed, Inspector Conway's focus on Dr. Langley intensified. The cigarette stub had become his chief suspect, and he questioned the household staff about Langley's movements. Grayson, the butler, confirmed that he had seen the doctor in the study at 11, but no one could account for his whereabouts after that. The inspector, satisfied with this lead, declared Langley the prime suspect. Motives unclear, he admitted, but he had the mean cyanides. Not hard to come by for a doctor. Miss Marple, however, was not convinced. The cigarette stub was too neatly placed, too perfectly aligned with Langley's habits. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a misplaced glove had led the police astray, only to reveal a cleverer hand at work. She resolved to examine the garden herself, but first she sought out Captain Falk, who was standing by the terrace doors, staring out at the grounds. Captain, she said, approaching with a smile, you mentioned a walk in the gardens last night. Did you happen to notice anyone else outside? Falk's weathered face creased in thought. It was dark, he said gruffly. I saw a light in Thorne's window round 10:30, but no one else. Just the usual night sounds, owls, wind, that sort of thing. A light in his window, Miss Marple repeated, her eyes bright. Was it steady, or did it flicker, as if someone were moving about? Falk frowned, considering. Steady, I think, but I wasn't paying close attention. Miss Marple thanked him and made her way to the terrace, where she examined the spot where the cigarette stub had been found. The ground was soft from recent rain, and she noted a faint footprint nearby, not a man's heavy boot, but a smaller, lighter tread, perhaps a woman's. She glanced back at the manor, her mind turning over the possibilities. Clara Langley, Vivian Harcourt, Beatrice Thorne, each could have walked here. Each could have dropped the stub to point suspicion at the doctor. As she returned to the drawing room, she overheard Charles and Vivian whispering in a corner. We can't tell them, Vivian said, her voice low and urgent. It'll only make things worse. Charles nodded, his expression grim. Just keep quiet, Viv. It's not our concern now. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Secrets, she thought, were like weeds in a garden left unchecked. They could choke the truth. She settled back into her chair. Her knitting resumed, but her mind was far from idle. The red herrings were multiplying, but she was determined to find the truth beneath them. Chapter 6. A clue in the details. Late afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of Greystone Manor, casting intricate patterns on the drawing-room floor. The air was heavy with unspoken accusations as the guests sat in uneasy silence, their eyes darting between one another and the door where Inspector Conway's men came and went. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting a constant companion, appeared absorbed in her work, but her sharp gaze missed nothing: the nervous tick in Clara Langley's cheek, the way Charles Ashby's hand lingered protectively on Vivian's shoulder, the subtle rigidity in Captain Falk's posture. The inspector, convinced that Dr. Langley was the key to the case, had shifted his focus to the cyanide vial, now sent to the laboratory for analysis. If it's medical grade, he had told his constable loudly enough for all to hear, that'll clinch it. Only a doctor like Langley would have access. Miss Marple, however, remained skeptical. The cigarette stub, the vial, the locked room, they were pieces of a puzzle. But the picture they formed was incomplete, deliberately so, she suspected. Her thoughts returned to the smudge of ink on the library desk, the crumpled paper with the word blackmail, and the faint footprint in the garden. These were not the bold strokes of a crime, but the delicate brush marks of a careful hand. She decided to explore further, beginning with the library, where she had last seen evidence of Thorne's final hours. Slipping away from the drawing room, Miss Marple made her way to the library, a quiet sanctuary of leather-bound books and polished wood. The room was undisturbed, save for the faint dust motes dancing in the slanting light. She approached the desk, her eyes drawn to the ink smudge she had noticed the previous day. It was still there, a faint black streak on the edge of the mahogany. But now she saw something else, a tiny speck of red wax, barely visible. Caught in the grain of the wood, she bent closer, her heart quickening. Beatrice had mentioned a letter with a red wax seal, burned by Thorne in a fit of anger. Could this be a trace of it? She examined the fireplace, where a few ashes lingered in the grate. Kneeling carefully, she sifted through them, her fingers deft despite her age. Among the charred remains, she found a fragment of paper no larger than a postage stamp, bearing a single word in Thorne's precise hand: debt. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Debt and blackmail, she murmured, two sides of a dangerous coin. She tucked the fragment into her reticule alongside the crumpled paper, her mind racing. Had Thorne been extorting someone over a debt, or was he himself ensnared by another's demands? Returning to the drawing room, she sought out Captain Falk, whose naval tales had grown quieter since the morning's grim discovery. "Captain," she said, settling beside him with a disarming smile, "you mentioned seeing a light in Mr. Thorne's window last night. Can you recall the exact time?" Falk rubbed his chin, his eyes narrowing. "Must have been close to 10:30. I was in the garden, as I said, taking a turn before bed. The light was steady, like I told you, and you saw no one else." Miss Marple's tone was gentle, but her eyes were keen, not a soul. Falk replied, though his fingers tightened briefly on the arm of his chair. "Just the manner." Quiet as a tomb, Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts turning to the footprint in the garden. A woman's shoe, she had surmised, but whose? She decided to speak with Vivian Harcourt next, whose nervous demeanor had not escaped her notice. Approaching the young woman, who stood by the window twisting her shawl, Miss Marple said, "Miss Harcourt, you must be dreadfully shaken by all this. Tell me, did you ever notice Mr. Thorne writing letters during his stay?" Vivian's eyes widened, then quickly dropped to the floor. "Letters? I don't think so. He was always scribbling in that notebook of his, but I never saw him post anything." "Scribbling?" Miss Marple repeated softly. "Did you ever see what he wrote?" Vivian shook her head, a little too quickly. "No, never. He was very private about his work." Miss Marple smiled, but her mind noted the lie. Vivian's hands, still twisting the shawl, betrayed her. A young woman engaged to a man like Charles Ashby, with a fortune at stake, might have reason to fear a solicitor's prying. Had Thorne uncovered something about her family's wealth or her own past? As the evening approached, Miss Marple joined Lady Eleanor for tea in the study, where she casually inquired about the manor's staff. "Grayson seems a most reliable butler," she remarked. "Does he always lock the doors himself?" "Oh, yes," Lady Eleanor replied, pouring the tea with a trembling hand. "He's been with us for years. Every night at 11. He checks the doors and windows. It's a habit from my father's time." "And the guest rooms?" Miss Marple asked, her tone light. "Are the keys kept in a particular place?" Lady Eleanor frowned, considering. "Grayson keeps the master key in the butler's pantry, locked in a drawer. Only he and I have access." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the locked door of Thorne's room. A master key suggested opportunity, but also control. Someone in the household, she reasoned, had planned this crime with precision, leaving clues like breadcrumbs to mislead the unwary. As she returned to the drawing room, she overheard Inspector Conway speaking to Charles Ashby. "Your argument with Thorne in the library," the inspector said, his voice stern. "Witnesses say it was heated. Care to explain?" Charles flushed, his voice rising. "It wasn't an argument, just a discussion. He was needling me about my business plans. That's all. I didn't kill him." Miss Marple's needles paused. The inspector's focus on Charles, like his earlier suspicion of Dr. Langley, was a distraction. She felt the real clue lay in the details: the red wax, the word debt, the whiskey in a claret drinker's room. Someone had orchestrated this crime with care, and she was determined to find the thread that would unravel it. As the clock struck 6, a constable entered with a report from the laboratory. The vial contained cyanide, as expected, but there was a trace of another substance, sugar syrup. Of all things, as if to mask the poison's taste. Miss Marple's eyes brightened. A sweet poison. She murmured to herself, "How very personal." She settled back into her chair, her knitting resumed. But her mind was a whirl of connections. The truth was close, she sensed, hidden in the smallest of details. Chapter 7. The lies unraveled. Evening shadows deepened over Greystone Manor, the flickering candlelight in the drawing room casting an almost theatrical glow over the assembled guests. The air was thick with tension, each person aware that the police, led by Inspector Conway, were closing in on a suspect. Yet Miss Jane Marple, seated unobtrusively with her knitting, knew that the truth lay not in the obvious clues but in the subtle contradictions that whispered beneath the surface. The laboratory report had confirmed the presence of cyanide in the vial, laced with sugar syrup to disguise its bitter taste. This detail intrigued Miss Marple, for it suggested a murderer who knew their victim well, someone who understood Thorne's habits and preferences. The whiskey in the tumbler, the red wax on the desk, the word dead on the burned fragment, all pointed to a crime rooted in personal motives, not random impulse. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a commotion at the door. Inspector Conway entered, his face grim, holding a small leather case. "Dr. Langley," he said, addressing the physician, who stood rigid by the fireplace, "we found this in your room. Care to explain?" Langley's eyes widened as Conway opened the case to reveal a set of medical instruments, including a small glass bottle labeled potassium cyanide. A murmur rippled through the room, and Clara Langley let out a stifled gasp. "It's not what you think," Langley protested, his voice hoarse. "That's for laboratory use, part of my old research kit. I haven't touched it in years." "Then why was it hidden under your mattress?" Conway demanded, his tone accusatory. Langley's face paled, and he stammered, "I didn't hide it. Someone must have placed it there." Miss Marple's needles slowed, her eyes narrowing. The discovery was damning, yet it felt staged, like a prop in a carefully rehearsed play. She recalled the cigarette stub in the garden, another clue that pointed to neatly at Langley. Someone, she thought, was working hard to direct suspicion. She rose quietly and approached Beatrice Thorne, who sat alone, her sketchbook clutched tightly to her chest. "Miss Thorne," Miss Marple said gently, "you mentioned your uncle burning a letter with a red wax seal. Did he ever speak of debts his own, or someone else's?" Beatrice's eyes flickered with unease, and she hesitated before answering. "He mentioned once that someone owed him a great deal, not money, exactly, but a debt of honor. He said it would be repaid, one way or another." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "And did he name this person?" Beatrice shook her head, her voice barely audible. "No, but he was angry. I've never seen him so cold." Miss Marple thanked her and moved to speak with Vivian Harcourt, who was standing near Charles, her face pale. "Miss Harcourt," she began, her tone soft but probing. "You seem troubled. Is there something you wish to share? Something, perhaps, about Mr. Thorne's inquiries into your family?" Vivian's hands trembled, and she glanced at Charles before replying. "He asked too many questions," she admitted, her voice low. "About my father's business, about how I came to inherit. It felt like he was looking for something to use against me." "Against you," Miss Marple repeated, her eyes keen. "Or against someone close to you?" Vivian's gaze dropped, and she said nothing more. Miss Marple noted the way Charles's hand tightened on her arm, a gesture of protection or control. She made a mental note to explore their relationship further. As the evening progressed, Miss Marple slipped away to the butler's pantry, where Grayson kept the master key. The room was tidy, with shelves of silver polish and neatly folded linens. The drawer where the key was stored was locked, as Lady Eleanor had said. But Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a faint scratch on the lock's edge, as if it had been tampered with. She frowned, considering the implications. A master key could unlock any room, including Thorne's. But who had access? Returning to the drawing room, she overheard Captain Fawkes speaking to Lady Eleanor in hushed tones. "I told you, Eleanor," he said. "Thorne was trouble. He had a way of digging up things better left buried." Lady Eleanor's face was strained. "But to die like this, Desmond, it's unthinkable." Miss Marple approached, her expression benign. "Captain Fawkes, you seem to have known Mr. Thorne well. Did he ever mention a debt from your naval days? Perhaps tied to that contract you quarreled over?" Fawkes' eyes hardened, but he answered calmly. "That was settled long ago. Thorne got his share, and I moved on. No debts between us." Miss Marple nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. The word debt, the red wax, the tampered lock, these were not random. Someone had planned Thorne's death with meticulous care, planting clues to mislead the police while hiding their own tracks. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a forged letter had led to a false confession. Was someone here playing a similar game? As the clock struck 9, Inspector Conway announced that Dr. Langley would be taken to the station for further questioning. Clara Langley burst into tears, clinging to her husband, while the others watched in uneasy silence. Miss Marple, however, remained calm, her knitting steady. The cyanide bottle, like the cigarette stub, was a red herring, she was certain. The real truth lay in the human heart and the secrets Thorne had uncovered, and the price someone was willing to pay to keep them buried. She retired to her room, her reticule heavy with the fragments of evidence she had collected. Sitting by the window, she gazed out at the darkened gardens, her mind turning over the clues. "A debt of honor," she murmured, "and a poison sweetened with care. Someone has been very clever but not clever enough." Chapter 8. The emotional turning point. Night had settled over Greystone Manor like a heavy cloak, the wind rattling the windows as if impatient for secrets to be revealed. The drawing room, where the guests remained under Inspector Conway's orders, was a cauldron of frayed nerves and stifled emotions. Dr. Langley's removal to the police station had cast a pall over the household, and Clara Langley's quiet sobs punctuated the silence, her handkerchief a sodden wreck in her hands. Miss Jane Marple, seated by the fire with her knitting, observed the scene with her usual quiet intensity, her mind sifting through the web of lies and half-truths that had begun to unravel. The discovery of the cyanide bottle in Langley's room had shifted suspicion firmly onto the doctor, but Miss Marple remained unconvinced. The clues, the cigarette stub, the tampered lock, the red wax speck, pointed to a more intricate design, one crafted to mislead. She sensed that the truth was close, hidden in the emotional undercurrents that swirled among the guests. As the clock struck 10, Clara Langley rose abruptly, her face streaked with tears. "I can't bear it any longer," she cried, her voice breaking the room's oppressive silence. "Hugh didn't do this, he couldn't have. But I know something, and I can't keep it inside anymore." The room froze. Charles Ashby, seated beside Vivian, stiffened, his hand tightening on hers. Captain Fawkes turned from the window, his weathered face alert. Lady Eleanor, pale but composed, leaned forward, while Beatrice Thorne clutched her sketchbook as if it were a lifeline. Inspector Conway, who had been reviewing his notes in a corner, strode forward, his eyes sharp. "Mrs. Langley, he said. "If you have information, you must share it now." Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze fixed on Clara. The woman's outburst was no surprise. She had seen the signs of strain in Clara's nervous gestures, her contradictory alibis. But what she said next would be critical. Clara's voice trembled as she spoke. "Last night, after dinner, I didn't go straight to bed. I went to the library to fetch a book. I saw Mr. Thorne there, and he was arguing with someone. I didn't see who it was, but I heard raised voices. Mr. Thorne said something about a debt being repaid, and the other person sounded angry, desperate. Even a murmur rippled through the room. Conway's pencil hovered over his notebook. "What time was this, Mrs. Langley?" he asked. "About 10, Clara replied, her eyes darting to the floor. "I didn't stay long. I took my book and left, but I heard footsteps following me up the stairs, and I was afraid." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Clara's story aligned with Charles's account of leaving Thorne in the library at 10, but it introduced a new figure, an unseen person arguing with the victim. Was this the truth, or another layer of deception? She noted the way Clara avoided looking at her husband's empty chair, as if guilt weighed heavier than grief. "Mrs. Langley," Miss Marple said gently, her voice cutting through the tension. "Did you recognize the other voice at all, even a hint of tone or accent?" Clara shook her head, her hands twisting the handkerchief. "No, I couldn't tell. It was muffled, and I was too nervous to stay." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over the possibilities. The argument in the library suggested a confrontation that may have led to Thorne's death. But Clara's vagueness was troubling. Was she protecting someone or herself? The inspector, seizing on the new information, turned to the others. "Anyone care to admit to being in the library with Thorne at 10? Speak now, or we'll dig deeper." Charles cleared his throat, his face flushed. "I told you, I left him there at 10. If someone else came after, I didn't see them." Vivian, clinging to his arm, nodded. "We went upstairs together. I didn't hear anything." Captain Falk, his voice gruff, added, "I was in the hall by 10:30. As I said, Thorne was alone when I saw him heading upstairs." Beatrice Thorne remained silent, her eyes fixed on her sketchbook. Miss Marple, watching her closely, noted the faint tremble in her fingers. "Miss Thorne," she said softly, "did you perhaps see or hear anything unusual last night? Even something small?" Beatrice's head snapped up, her eyes wide. I was in my room, sketching. I didn't go near the library." Miss Marple smiled, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Beatrice's quick denial, like Clara's outburst, felt rehearsed. The emotional weight of the moment had cracked open a door, but the truth remained just out of reach. As the guests dispersed to their rooms under police supervision, Miss Marple lingered in the drawing room, her knitting idle in her lap. She considered the new clues. Clara's claim of an argument, the debt mentioned in the burned fragment, the tampered lock on the butler's drawer. Each pointed to a motive rooted in desperation, a debt, perhaps, that Thorne had used to manipulate someone in this house. She rose and made her way to the library once more, her steps silent on the thick carpet. The room was dark now, save for the moonlight streaming through the windows. She approached the desk, her fingers brushing the spot where the red wax speck had been. The ink smudge was still there, a silent witness to Thorne's final hours. She opened the drawer, finding it empty save for a single sheet of blotting paper, faintly marked with reversed handwriting. Carefully, she held the blotting paper to a mirror, deciphering the faint impressions. They were fragments of a letter, written in Thorne's hand. "Repay what you owe, or the truth will." The rest was illegible, but the implication was clear. Thorne had been pressing someone, and that pressure had led to his death. Miss Marple tucked the blotting paper into her reticule, her mind alight with connections. The argument Clara overheard, the debt, the blackmail noted, all pointed to a victim who had pushed too far, and a killer who had struck back. But who? Charles, with his risky venture, Vivian, guarding her family's secrets, or someone else, hiding in plain sight? As she returned to her room, the manor creaked around her, as if whispering its secrets. "The heart," Miss Marple murmured, "is where the truth lies, and someone's heart is breaking under the weight of it." Chapter 9. The trap is set morning of the third day at Greystone Manor, dawn gray and heavy, the clouds pressing low over the estate as if mirroring the weight of suspicion within its walls. The guests, still confined to the manor under Inspector Conway's orders, moved through their routines with a strained politeness, their eyes betraying the fear and mistrust that simmered beneath. Miss Jane Marple, ever the unobtrusive observer, sat in the drawing room with her knitting, her mind a whirl of connections drawn from the clues she had gathered, the red wax, the word debt, the tampered lock, and the blotting paper with its ominous fragment of a letter. Clara Langley's emotional outburst the previous night had shifted the dynamics of the household. Her claim of overhearing an argument in the library had cast a shadow over everyone, and Inspector Conway, though still focused on Dr. Langley, was now pressing for more details about the mysterious second voice. Miss Marple, however, suspected that the truth lay not in what was said, but in what was concealed. The killer, she believed, was growing nervous, and nervous people made mistakes. She decided it was time to apply a gentle pressure, of her own, a trap, not of force, but of psychology. Rising from her chair, she approached Lady Eleanor, who was arranging flowers in a vase with a distracted air. "Eleanor, my dear," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but deliberate, "I wonder if we might gather everyone this evening for a small discussion, nothing formal, just a chance to clear the air. I find that talking openly often brings hidden things to light." Lady Eleanor's eyes widened, but she nodded. "Of course, Jane, anything to help resolve this dreadful affair. Shall I arrange it for after dinner?" "Perfect," Miss Marple replied, her smile serene, but her mind calculating. She knew that a gathering, with all suspects present, would create an atmosphere ripe for revelation. The guilty, she had observed, often betrayed themselves when confronted with their own lies. Throughout the day, Miss Marple continued her quiet observations. She spoke briefly with Charles Ashby, noting the way his eyes darted toward Vivian whenever Thorne's name was mentioned. "Mr. Ashby," she said, pausing near him in the hall, "you mentioned Mr. Thorne's concerns about your shipping venture. Did he ever suggest he had evidence of some kind? Documents, perhaps?" Charles's face tightened. "Evidence? No, nothing like that. He just talked, always implying he knew more than he did. It was his way of keeping people off balance." Miss Marple nodded, but her thoughts lingered on the blotting paper's fragment. "Repay what you owe, or the truth will." Had Thorne been threatening Charles with exposure, perhaps of financial missteps or something more personal? She next approached Vivian Harcourt, who was reading in the conservatory, though her eyes barely moved across the page. "Miss Harcourt," Miss Marple said gently, "you seem preoccupied. Is there something weighing on you, something Mr. Thorne might have known?" Vivian's fingers froze on the book, and she looked up, her face pale. "I've told you, Miss Marple," he asked, "about my family's money, nothing more. I don't know what you're getting at." Miss Marple's smile was kind but unwavering. "Sometimes, my dear, the things we don't say speak the loudest." Vivian's lips parted, but no words came. She turned back to her book, her hands trembling slightly. Miss Marple made a mental note. Vivian was hiding something, and it was tied to Thorne's inquiries. As evening approached, the household gathered in the drawing room after dinner, the fire casting a warm but uneasy glow. Inspector Conway, though skeptical of Miss Marple's plan, agreed to attend, his notebook at the ready. The guests took their seats. Charles and Vivian close together, Captain Falk by the window, Clara Langley clutching a fresh handkerchief, Beatrice Thorne with her sketchbook, and Lady Eleanor presiding with strained dignity. Miss Marple stood, her small figure commanding attention despite its unassuming air. "My friends," she began, her voice clear and steady, "we are all troubled by Mr. Thorne's death, but I believe the truth is within our grasp if we look closely at the facts. Let us consider what we know." She paced slowly, her eyes moving from face to face. "Mr. Thorne died of cyanide poisoning, administered in a tumbler of whiskey laced with sugar syrup. His room was locked, yet the master keys drawer shows signs of tampering. A cigarette stub was found in the garden, pointing to Dr. Langley, yet it seems too convenient. And then there is the matter of a letter with a red wax seal, burned in anger. and a note in Mr. Thorne's hand that speaks of blackmail and debt. A gasp escaped Clara Langley, and Charles's hand tightened on Vivian's. Beatrice's. Pencil slipped from her fingers, clattering to the floor. Miss Marple continued, her tone calm but relentless. Someone in this room argued with Mr. Thorne in the library at 10 o'clock. Someone knew of his plans, his threats, and someone ensured that he would never speak of them again. Captain Fawkes shifted uncomfortably, his voice gruff. You're suggesting one of us is a murderer. Miss Marple, that's a bold claim. Not bold, Captain, she replied softly, merely logical. The clues tell a story, but they require the right interpretation. For instance, why was there whiskey in Mr. Thorne's room when he drank only claret at dinner? Who brought it to him, and why? The room fell silent, the weight of her words pressing on every heart. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on each face, searching for the crack in their composure. Vivian's gaze dropped, Charles's jaw clenched, and Clara's hands twisted her handkerchief into knots. Beatrice, pale and silent, stared at the floor, while Captain Fawkes' fingers drummed a restless rhythm. Inspector Conway leaned forward, his interest piqued. You've got something, Miss Marple. What are you driving at? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Only this. Inspector, the truth is like a skein of wool. Pull the right thread, and it unravels. I believe we are very close to finding that thread. She resumed her seat, her knitting in hand, but the trap was set. The guilty party, she knew, would feel the pressure mounting. A nervous glance, a hasty word, a careless gesture, something would betray them before the night was through. As the guests dispersed, their faces etched with unease, Miss Marple remained by the fire, her needles clicking softly. The truth was near, she could feel it, but it would require one final push to bring it into the light. Chapter 10. The revealed atmosphere in Greystone Manor's drawing room was taut as a bowstring, the fire's glow casting flickering shadows that seemed to dance with the secrets of the house. Miss Jane Marple had set her trap the previous evening, and now, on the fourth morning since Reginald Thorne's death, she was ready to unveil the truth. The guests, summoned once more by Lady Eleanor at Miss Marple's request, sat in a tense semicircle, their faces a mixture of dread and anticipation. Inspector Conway stood by the door, his notebook open, his skepticism tempered by curiosity. Miss Marple, her knitting folded neatly in her lap, stood before them, her small figure radiating quiet authority. My friends, she began, her voice clear and measured, we have gathered to resolve the tragedy that has befallen this house. Mr. Reginald Thorne was murdered, and the truth of his death lies not in the obvious clues, but in the subtle threads that connect them. Let us unravel the mystery together. She paced slowly, her eyes moving from face to face. Charles Ashby, gripping Vivian's hand. Vivian Harcourt, pale and tense. Clara Langley, her eyes red from crying. Captain Fawkes, rigid and watchful. Beatrice Thorne, clutching her sketchbook. And Lady Eleanor, her composure fraying at the edges. First, Miss Marple continued. The facts: Mr. Thorne died of cyanide poisoning, delivered in a tumbler of whiskey laced with sugar syrup to mask the taste. His room was locked, but the master keys drawer showed signs of tampering. A cigarette stub, conveniently pointing to Dr. Langley, was found in the garden, yet its placement was too perfect. A note in Thorne's hand bore the word blackmail, and a fragment of a burned letter mentioned a debt. A speck of red wax and a blotting paper revealed a threat: repay what you owe, or the truth will. A murmur rippled through the room, but Miss Marple raised a hand for silence. These clues, she said, suggest a crime of calculation, not impulse. Mr. Thorne was a man who dealt in secrets, and one of those secrets cost him his life. Let us begin with the whiskey. Thorne drank only claret at dinner, yet a tumbler of whiskey was found in his room. Who brought it to him, and why? Her gaze settled on Charles Ashby, whose face flushed. Mr. Ashby, you argued with Thorne in the library at 10 over your shipping venture. You said he implied you were reckless, unfit for Miss Harcourt's trust, but was there more to it? Did he know something about your finances, perhaps a debt you could not repay? Charles's jaw tightened. I told you, it was just talk. I didn't bring him any whiskey. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes moving to Vivian. Miss Harcourt, You admitted Thorne questioned your family's wealth. You feared his prying, did you not? Perhaps he uncovered a truth about your inheritance, a truth you wished to keep hidden. Vivian's eyes widened, but she shook her head. I had nothing to hide. He was nosy, that's all. Miss Marple turned to Captain Falk. Captain, you saw a light in Thorne's window at 10:30, and you admitted to an old grudge over a naval contract, a debt of honor, perhaps, that Thorne held over you. Falk's face darkened. That was years ago. I had no reason to kill him. Miss Marple's gaze softened as it fell on Clara Langley. Mrs. Langley, you overheard an argument in the library, but your story shifted first to sleep by 10, then fetching a book. Were you protecting your husband or someone else? Clara's hands twisted her handkerchief. I told the truth. I heard voices, but I didn't see who it was. Finally, Miss Marple turned to Beatrice Thorne, whose fingers trembled on her sketchbook. Miss Thorne, you spoke of a letter with a red wax seal, burned by your uncle. You said he mentioned a debt of honor. But there is more, isn't there? You knew what he was doing, didn't you? Beatrice's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head violently. I didn't. I loved him. Miss Marple paused, her voice gentle but relentless. Let us piece it together. The whiskey was brought to Thorne's room after 10, when he was last seen alive. The cyanide was mixed with sugar syrup, a personal touch to ensure he drank it. The master key was used to lock the room, and the drawer was tampered with to suggest an outsider. The cigarette stub was placed to implicate Dr. Langley, and the blackmail note and burned letter pointed to a motive rooted in secrets. But the key lies in the red wax and the blotting paper. They tell us Thorne was threatening someone not with money, but with exposure. She turned to Beatrice, her eyes kind but piercing. Miss Thorne, your uncle was a blackmailer. He held a secret over someone in this house, and that person struck back. You found his letter in the library, didn't you? You saw the name he was threatening, and you acted to protect someone you cared for. Beatrice's face crumpled, and she burst into sobs. No, I didn't kill him, but I knew he was cruel. He was threatening Charles about his debts, about losing Vivian's money. I saw the letter, and I told Charles to be careful. That's all. Charles leapt to his feet, his face ashen. Beatrice, stop. You don't know what you're saying. Miss Marple's voice cut through the chaos. Mr. Ashby, you brought the whiskey to Thorne's room, didn't you? You knew he was threatening to ruin you, to expose your financial troubles to Vivian's family. You mixed the cyanide with sugar syrup, a trick you learned from your time in the colonies, where such poisons were used discreetly. You used the master key, taken from the tampered drawer, to lock the room and returned it before Grayson noticed. The cigarette stub was a clever touch, pointing to Dr. Langley, who had no motive but was an easy target. Charles's face drained of color, his hands shaking. You can't prove that. It's all supposition. Miss Marple smiled faintly. The blotting paper, Mr. Ashby, bears your initials faint, but clear in the mirror. You wrote to Thorne, promising to repay your debt, but you chose another way. You killed him to save yourself. Vivian gasped, pulling away from Charles, while Lady Eleanor covered her face. Inspector Conway stepped forward, his voice grim. Mr. Ashby, you'll come with me. As Charles was led away, protesting his innocence, Miss Marple sat down. Her knitting resumed. The room was silent, save for Beatrice's quiet sobs. The truth, as always, had been in the details that only the little gray cells could weave into a pattern. Chapter 11. The reflection the morning after Charles Ashby's arrest. Greystone Manor seemed to exhale, as if the weight of its secrets had been lifted. Though a somber air lingered in its halls, the guests, no longer confined to the drawing room, moved with a quiet unease, their conversations hushed and their glances wary. The police had departed with Charles in custody, and Inspector Conway, though initially skeptical of Miss Jane Marple's methods, had conceded her brilliance with a grudging nod. Yet for Miss Marple, the case was not quite closed, not until the human heart had been fully understood. She sat in the conservatory, a bright room filled with potted ferns and the faint scent of damp earth, her knitting resting in her lap. The sun, breaking through the morning clouds, cast a soft light over her, illuminating the fine lines of her face and the sharp clarity of her eyes. Lady Eleanor joined her, carrying a tray of tea, her hands steadier than they had been in days, but her expression heavy with sorrow. "Jane," Lady Eleanor said, pouring the tea with care, "you've saved us from a terrible shadow, but at such a cost. Charles, I never would have believed it." "How did you know?" Miss Marple accepted the cup, her smile gentle but tinged with melancholy. "It is always the small things, Eleanor, that reveal the truth. A man like Charles Ashby, so charming and ambitious, could not bear the thought of losing everything: his fiancée's fortune, his reputation, his future. Mr. Thorne's blackmail was a threat he could not ignore." Lady Eleanor shook her head, her eyes distant. "But to kill, and to do it so coldly, with that poisoned whiskey, it's monstrous." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her thoughts drifting to the clues that had unraveled the crime. "The whiskey was the key," she said softly. "Mr. Thorne was particular in his tastes, drinking only claret at dinner. Yet there was whiskey in his room, laced with sugar syrup to mask the cyanide's bitterness. It was a personal act, planned by someone who knew him well. Charles, with his debts and desperation, had the motive and the means. The tampered lock, the planted cigarette stub, the careful staging, it was all designed to point elsewhere, to Dr. Langley or an unknown intruder." Lady Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she set down her cup. And poor Beatrice, knowing her uncle was blackmailing Charles, she must have been torn apart. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes softening. "Miss Thorne is a sensitive girl, loyal to her uncle but aware of his flaws. She saw the letter with the red wax seal and warned Charles, not realizing it would push him to murder. Her silence was her way of protecting him, but it could not hide the truth." They sat in silence for a moment, the conservatory's quiet broken only by the distant chirping of birds. Miss Marple's mind turned to the others: Vivian Harcourt, whose fear of exposure had made her a suspect; Captain Falk, whose old grudge had clouded his judgment; Clara Langley, whose nervous lies had masked only her own insecurities. Each had played a part in the drama, their secrets and fears weaving the tapestry that Charles had exploited. "I suppose," Lady Eleanor said at last, "that you've seen this sort of thing before, Jane. People driven to such acts by their own weaknesses, too often." "I'm afraid," Miss Marple replied, her voice quiet. "Human nature is a curious thing, Eleanor. We all carry our little burdens: pride, greed, fear, and sometimes they lead us to terrible choices. But it is in understanding those burdens that we find the truth. The little gray cells, as my friend Poirot might say, must always be at work, seeing what others overlook." Lady Eleanor managed a faint smile. "You're remarkable, Jane. I don't know how we'd have managed without you." Miss Marple waved a hand dismissively. "I only observe, my dear, people are not so different. Whether in St. Mary Mead or a grand manor like this, they love, they fear, they hide, and sometimes they destroy." As the morning wore on, Miss Marple prepared to depart. Her small suitcase was packed, her knitting tucked neatly inside, and Grayson, the butler, arranged for a car to take her to the station. The other guests gathered in the hall to bid her farewell, their faces a mixture of gratitude and relief. Vivian Harcourt, her engagement now a painful memory, offered a quiet thank you, her eyes red but resolute. Captain Falk shook her hand firmly, his gruff voice softened by respect. Clara Langley, still shaken, murmured her gratitude, while Beatrice Thorne, pale but composed, managed a small nod. Inspector Conway, lingering by the door, approached last. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone formal but warm, "you've a knack for this. If you ever tire of St. Mary Mead, the force could use you." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "Oh, Inspector, I'm far too old for such adventures. Besides, I find my little village keeps me quite busy enough." With a final wave, she stepped into the car, the manor receding behind her as it wound through the Devonshire hills. She gazed out at the autumn landscape, her mind reflecting on the case. Charles Ashby's desperation had driven him to murder, but it was the small details: the whiskey, the wax, the blotting paper that had betrayed him. The truth, she thought, was always there, waiting for someone to notice. As the train carried her back to St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple opened her knitting bag. her fingers brushing the crumpled paper with the word blackmail. She smiled faintly, tucking it away. The world was full of puzzles, and she would always be ready to solve them, one stitch at a time. Chapter 12. The unsettled dust train from Devonshire to St. Mary Mead rattled gently through the countryside, its rhythm a soothing counterpoint to the turmoil Miss Jane Marple had left behind at Greystone Man. Yet, as she sat in her compartment, her knitting idle in her lap, her mind was far from settled. The arrest of Charles Ashby had brought a resolution to the murder of Reginald Thorne, but something nagged at her, a loose thread in the tapestry of the case that refused to be tied. She reviewed the facts once more, her little gray cells as active as ever. Charles had poisoned Thorne with cyanide-laced whiskey, driven by the threat of blackmail over his debts, the tampered lock, the planted cigarette stub, the blotting paper with his initials all pointed to his guilt. Yet Miss Marple's intuition, honed by years of observing human nature, whispered that the picture was not complete. There was a detail, small but significant, that she had overlooked. As the train neared her village, she opened her reticule and withdrew the crumpled paper with the word blackmail, and the fragment of burned letter with the word debt. She studied them in the dim light, her lips pursing slightly. The red wax seal Beatrice had mentioned, the argument Clara overheard in the library, the sugar syrup in the poison. These were personal touches. But was Charles truly capable of such meticulous planning alone? His desperation was clear, but his cunning was less certain. Back in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple settled into her cottage, the familiar comforts of her parlor doing little to quiet her restless thoughts. She telephoned Lady Eleanor that evening, her voice calm but purposeful. "Eleanor, my dear," she said, "I've been thinking about our time at Greystone. Might I trouble you for a small favor? Could you have Grayson check the library fireplace again? There may be more ashes worth examining." Lady Eleanor, though surprised, agreed. "Of course, Jane. But Charles has confessed, hasn't he? The police say the case is closed." "Confessed? Yes," Miss Marple replied softly, "but the heart does not always confess the whole truth. Indulge an old woman's curiosity, if you will." The next morning, a letter arrived from Greystone Manor, sent by express. Inside was a note from Lady Eleanor, and a small envelope containing a few additional fragments of ash, carefully collected by Grayson. Among them was another tiny scrap of paper, barely legible, but bearing a single phrase in Thorne's hand. "Her secret." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Her secret," she murmured, setting the fragment beside the others. The pronoun was a revelation, shifting the focus from Charles's debts to a woman in the household. Vivian Harcourt, with her guarded demeanor, Clara Langley, with her nervous contradictions, or Beatrice Thorne, whose loyalty to her uncle masked a deeper knowledge. She considered Vivian most closely. The young heiress had been evasive about her family's wealth, flinching at Thorne's probing questions. Charles had killed to protect his future with her. But what if Vivian had her own secret, a scandal or shame that Thorne had uncovered? The sugar syrup, a feminine touch, suggested someone with intimate knowledge of Thorne's tastes. Could Vivian have been complicit, perhaps guiding Charles's hand? Miss Marple telephoned Inspector Conway, her tone polite but insistent. "Inspector," she said, "I wonder if you might look into Miss Harcourt's background, her family's business dealings, perhaps. Mr. Thorne was a solicitor with a knack for uncovering secrets. It's possible he knew something about her that we've overlooked." Conway, though busy with paperwork, agreed to make inquiries. "You're not satisfied, Miss Marple?" he asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. "Ashby's confessed, and the evidence is airtight." "Evidence can be too airtight, Inspector," she replied. "It's the human element that matters most." That afternoon, Miss Marple took a walk through St. Mary Mead, her thoughts turning over the case. She recalled a conversation with her nephew, Raymond West, about the psychology of crime. People, he had said, act out of love or fear, but rarely alone. Charles's act was driven by fear of losing Vivian. But what if Vivian's fear of exposure, of losing her status, had spurred him on? By evening, a telegram arrived from Conway. It was brief but illuminating. Vivian Harcourt's father had been involved in a financial scandal years ago, hushed up but known to certain legal circles. Thorne, as a solicitor, might have discovered this, threatening to expose it unless Vivian paid or persuaded Charles to act. Miss Marple sat by her fire. Her knitting resumed, but her mind was alight. Charles was the murderer. Yes, but Vivian's secret had been the spark. She had not wielded the poison, but her fear had shaped the crime. The case, she realized, was not just about a single act, but about the tangled web of human desires that had led to it. She penned a note to Lady Eleanor, suggesting that Vivian be watched closely, not as a criminal, but as a young woman in need of guidance. The heart, she wrote, is a fragile thing, and secrets can wound it deeply. As she sealed the letter, Miss Marple felt the loose thread finally settle. The truth was not always tidy, but it was always there, waiting for those who looked closely enough. Chapter 13. The echoes of truth quiet of St. Mary Mead enveloped Miss Jane Marple. As she sat in her cottage, the soft ticking of the mantel clock a gentle reminder of time's steady march. The events at Greystone Manor lingered in her mind, not as a closed case, but as a puzzle with lingering echoes. Charles Ashby's confession and arrest had brought a semblance of resolution. Yet the new fragment of evidence, the burned paper bearing the phrase "her secret," had stirred Miss Marple's curiosity anew. The truth, she knew, was rarely a single thread but a tapestry woven from many. The telegram from Inspector Conway about Vivian Harcourt's father had confirmed her suspicions. Reginald Thorne had uncovered a scandal, a shadow over the Harcourt fortune that Vivian had fought to keep buried. But Miss Marple wondered if Vivian's role was more than that of a passive catalyst. Had she known of Charles's plan, perhaps even encouraged it? The sugar syrup and the poison, the tampered lock, the careful planting of clues all suggested a mind as subtle as it was desperate, determined to tie up the final loose ends. Miss Marple telephoned Lady Eleanor once more. "Eleanor, my dear," she said, her voice warm but purposeful. "I've been thinking about Miss Harcourt. Might you invite her to tea, perhaps with Beatrice Thorne? A quiet conversation, away from the manor's shadows, could be illuminating." Lady Eleanor, though weary, agreed. "I'll arrange it, Jane. Vivian has been so withdrawn since Charles's arrest, and poor Beatrice is still grieving her uncle. Perhaps it will do them good." 2 days later, Miss Marple traveled back to Devonshire. Arriving at a small tea-room in a nearby village, the setting was quaint, with lace curtains and the gentle clink of porcelain, a stark contrast to the tension of Greystone Manor. Vivian Harcourt and Beatrice Thorne sat across from her, their faces pale but composed. Lady Eleanor, acting as hostess, poured the tea, her eyes darting between the two young women. Miss Marple began with her usual disarming gentleness. "Miss Harcourt, Miss Thorne," she said, "I know these days have been trying, but sometimes speaking plainly can lighten the heart. Mr. Thorne's death has left many questions, and I believe you both hold pieces of the answer." Vivian's hands tightened around her teacup, her eyes wary. "I've told you everything, Miss Marple. Charles acted alone. I didn't know what he was planning." Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her voice was steady. "And yet, my dear, you knew Mr. Thorne was a threat. He had discovered something about your father's past, a financial scandal, perhaps, that could have ruined your engagement. Did you ever speak to Charles about it?" Vivian's lips parted, then closed. She glanced at Beatrice, who sat silently, her fingers tracing the edge of her sketchbook. I told Charles that Thorne was asking questions," Vivian admitted at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I didn't tell him to do anything." Miss Marple nodded, turning to Beatrice. "And you, Miss Thorne, saw your uncle's letter with the red wax seal. You warned Charles to be careful, but did you know what he intended?" Beatrice's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head. "No, I only knew Uncle Reginald was hurting people. He was cruel sometimes, using secrets to control them. I told Charles because I felt sorry for him, but I never thought he'd." Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands. Lady Eleanor reached out, touching Beatrice's shoulder gently. "Oh, my dear, you couldn't have known." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind piecing together the final threads. "Miss Harcourt," she said, "the sugar syrup and the poison was an unusual choice, one that suggests a feminine touch. Did you ever prepare drinks for Mr. Thorne? Perhaps during one of his late-night meetings? Vivian's face drained of color. Once or twice, at Charles's request. He said it would keep Thorne in a good mood. But I didn't know about the poison, I swear. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. And the whiskey, Miss Harcourt. Did you bring it to his room that night? Vivian hesitated, her voice trembling. Yes, but only because Charles asked me to. He said Thorne wanted a nightcap. I left it on his bedside table and went to bed. I didn't know what was in it, Miss. Marple leaned back, her expression unreadable. Vivian's admission was the missing piece, a small act, seemingly innocent, that had enabled Charles's crime. She had not mixed the poison, but she had delivered the means, perhaps suspecting more than she admitted. The sugar syrup, Miss Marple realized, might have been Vivian's own touch, a subconscious attempt to sweeten a bitter act. Miss Harcourt, she said gently, you must tell the police everything. The truth, however painful, will set you free. Vivian nodded, tears streaming down her face. Beatrice reached out, taking her hand, and the two young women sat in shared silence, their burdens laid bare. Lady Eleanor looked to Miss Marple, her eyes filled with gratitude. You've done it again, Jane, she said softly. You've seen what none of us could. Miss Marple smiled faintly. I only see what people reveal. Eleanor, the heart always speaks if one knows how to listen. As she left the tea room, the autumn wind tugging at her shawl, Miss Marple felt the case settle into place. Charles was the murderer, but Vivian's complicity, however unwitting, had shaped the crime. The echoes of truth had been faint, but they had led her to the heart of the matter, as they always did. Chapter 14. The final threads. The autumn afternoon in St. Mary Mead was crisp, the air carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves as Miss Jane Marple returned to her cottage. After her revealing tea with Vivian Harcourt and Beatrice Thorne, the quiet village, with its familiar rhythms, offered a stark contrast to the turmoil of Greystone Manor. Yet Miss Marple's mind remained tethered to the case. Vivian's admission that she had delivered the whiskey to Reginald Thorne's room at Charles's behest had clarified the mechanics of the crime, but a few threads still dangled, teasing her with their untidiness. Seated by her parlor fire, Miss Marple spread out her collection of clues, the crumpled paper with the word blackmail, the burned fragment with debt, the ash bearing her secret, and her notes on the tampered lock and the sugar syrup. Each had played its part in unmasking Charles Ashby as the murderer, with Vivian as his unwitting accomplice. Yet something in the sequence of events troubled her. The sugar syrup, in particular, nagged at her intuition. It was a detail to intimate, too deliberate, for Charles alone to have conceived. She telephoned Inspector Conway, her voice as calm and precise as ever. Inspector, she said, I've been reflecting on Miss Harcourt's statement. She admitted to delivering the whiskey, but I wonder if you might inquire further about her interactions with Mr. Thorne. In the days before his death, did she, perhaps, have any private meetings with him? Conway, though accustomed to Miss Marple's persistence, sounded weary. Miss Marple, Ashby's confessed, and Miss Harcourt's corroborated his story. The case is solid, but I'll humor you. Any specific angle you're after? Only the truth, Inspector, she replied softly. Sometimes it hides in the smallest gestures. The following morning, Conway sent a telegram with new information. Vivian had admitted to a brief meeting with Thorne in the library 2 days before his death, during which he had pressed her about her father's financial scandal. He hinted he could ruin me, Vivian had told the police, but I thought he was just fishing. I didn't tell Charles the details, only that Thorne was trouble. Miss Marple nodded to herself, the pieces falling into place. Vivian's fear of exposure had driven her to confide in Charles, who, in his desperation, had taken drastic action. But the sugar syrup suggested a deeper involvement, perhaps not in the act of murder, but in its conception. Had Vivian, knowingly or not, suggested a way to mask the poison's taste? Her familiarity with Thorne's habits, gained through those tense conversations, made it plausible. Determined to test her theory, Miss Marple wrote to Lady Eleanor, requesting a final piece of information. Eleanor, my dear, she wrote, could you ask Grayson if any sugar syrup was kept in the Manor's kitchen, and if so, who had access to it? The reply came swiftly. Grayson confirmed that a bottle of sugar syrup was kept in the pantry, primarily for desserts, and that Vivian had once helped the cook prepare a pudding during her stay, handling the syrup herself. This small detail, innocuous on its own, confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions. Vivian's touch was on the crime. Even if her hand had not poured the poison, she invited Vivian to visit St. Mary Mead, framing it as a chance to escape the Manor's oppressive atmosphere. Vivian arrived the next day, her auburn hair neatly pinned, but her eyes shadowed with guilt. They sat in Miss Marple's garden, the late autumn roses still blooming defiantly. "Miss Harcourt," Miss Marple began, her tone gentle but firm, "you've been honest about delivering the whiskey, but there is more to tell, isn't there? The sugar syrup, for instance. You knew Mr. Thorne's tastes, and you handled the syrup in the kitchen. Did you suggest to Charles how to make the poison more palatable?" Vivian's hands trembled, and she looked away, her voice barely audible. I didn't mean for it to happen. I told Charles that Thorne liked sweet drinks. That sugar syrup could hide a bitter taste. I was angry, frightened he was going to ruin us. But I didn't know Charles would. I thought he'd just confront him." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her resolve was unshaken. "You must tell the police, my dear, not to condemn yourself, but to free your conscience. You did not kill Mr. Thorne, but your words shaped the crime." Vivian nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I'll tell them. I can't carry this any longer." Miss Marple watched as Vivian left, her figure small against the village lane. The case was truly closed now, the final threads woven into place. Charles had acted out of desperation, Vivian out of fear, and Thorne's own cruelty had set the stage. The sugar syrup, a detail so small it might have been overlooked, had been the key to understanding their shared guilt. As she returned to her knitting, Miss Marple reflected on the fragility of human nature. "We are all capable of mistakes," she murmured, "but it is in facing them that we find redemption." Chapter 15. The quiet departure. The autumn sun dipped low over St. Mary Mead, casting a golden glow across the village's tidy cottages and winding lanes. Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlor, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm, the fire crackling softly in the grate. The case at Greystone Manor was now fully resolved, its secrets laid bare like the leaves scattered across her garden. Vivian Harcourt's confession to the police, admitting her role in suggesting the sugar syrup, had completed the picture, revealing the subtle interplay of fear and desperation that had driven Charles Ashby to murder Reginald Thorne. Yet, for Miss Marple, the resolution brought not triumph, but a quiet reflection on the frailties of the human heart. She had received a letter from Lady Eleanor that morning, written in her elegant hand, expressing gratitude and a touch of awe. "Jane," it read, "you have brought light to our darkest hour. Vivian is free, though her heart is heavy, and Beatrice is finding solace in her sketching. Greystone Manor will heal, thanks to you." Enclosed was a small pressed rose from the Manor's garden, a gesture that warmed Miss Marple's heart. As she sipped her tea, Miss Marple thought back over the case. The clues: the crumpled note with blackmail, the burned fragment with debt, the ash bearing her secret, the tampered lock. The sugar syrup had all pointed to a crime, woven from personal motives. Charles's desperation to secure Vivian's fortune had led him to poison Thorne. But Vivian's fear of her family's scandal had shaped the act, her suggestion of the syrup a subtle but critical contribution. Beatrice's warning, Clara's contradictions, Captain Fawkes' grudge, all had been threads in the tapestry, each revealing a facet of human nature. Miss Marple's nephew, Raymond West, arrived for a visit that afternoon, his curiosity piqued by her latest adventure. "Aunt Jane," he said, settling into an armchair with a grin, "you've outdone yourself again. A blackmailer poisoned, a manor full of suspects, and you unravel it all with a few bits of paper and a knitting needle. How do you do it, Miss?" Marple chuckled softly, her eyes twinkling. "It's not the knitting, Raymond, though it does help one think. It's simply a matter of listening to what people say, and what they don't, the little things, the contradictions, the glances they tell the story." Raymond leaned forward, his writer's mind eager for details. "But Vivian's part in it, how did you know she wasn't just a bystander? The sugar syrup?" Miss Marple replied, her needles pausing. "It was too personal to intimate. A choice for Charles alone. Vivian knew Thorne's tastes, and her fear of exposure gave her words weight. She didn't intend murder, but her heart spoke louder than she realized. Raymond shook his head, impressed. You see people, Aunt Jane, in a way I never could. It's like you read their souls. Not their souls, dear, she said gently, just their actions. People are much the same. Whether in St. Mary Mead or a grand manor, they love, they fear, they hide and sometimes they err. But the truth is always there, waiting to be seen. As evening fell, Miss Marple walked to the village post box to mail a reply to Lady Eleanor. Her shawl drawn close against the chill, the letter was brief, expressing her hopes for the manor's recovery and her affection for her old friend. Keep an eye on Vivian, she wrote, for she will need kindness to find her way, returning home. She paused by her garden gate, gazing at the roses still clinging to their stems. The case had been a reminder, as all her cases were, of the delicate balance between justice and compassion. Charles would face the law, Vivian would carry her guilt, and Greystone Manor would bear its scars. But life, like her knitting, would go on, each stitch building on the last. Miss Marple entered her cottage, the door closing softly behind her. She settled by the fire, her needles resuming their rhythm, and turned her thoughts to the quiet routines of St. Mary Mead. Another puzzle had been solved, another truth uncovered. But there would always be more, she knew, waiting in the shadows of human nature. And she would be ready, with her little gray cells and her unerring eye for the small things that mattered most.